In November of 1856, Melville, distraught over what appeared to be the total wreckage of his literary career, decided to travel in hopes of restoring some energy, returning to the United States refreshed, perhaps to lecture on his travels. On his way out to Jerusalem and Egypt, he stopped briefly to see his old friend Nathaniel Hawthorne, then serving as consul, American consul in Liverpool. They met, and Hawthorne leaves this account of his meeting with Melville at that time. We sat down in a hollow among the sand hills and smoked a cigar. Melville, as he always does, began to reason of providence and futurity and of everything that lies beyond human ken, and informed me that he had pretty much made up his mind to be annihilated. But still he does not seem to rest in that anticipation, and I think will never rest until he gets hold of a definite belief. It is strange how he persists, and has persisted ever since I knew him, and probably long before, in wandering to and fro over these deserts, as dismal and monotonous as the sandhills amidst which we were sitting. He can neither believe nor be comfortable in his unbelief, and he is too honest and courageous not to try to do one or the other. If he were a religious man, he would be one of the most truly religious and reverential. He has a very high and noble nature, and better worth immortality than the rest of us. This is a powerful portrait of a man who set himself up, metaphysically speaking, to fail. This is a man who is too honest intellectually to have blind faith in a God. But at the same time, he cannot lose that faith. So he's a man who's too skeptical to believe in God, but retains a faith that inspires him to want to believe in God. So he's in this sort of emotional and metaphysical limbo, let's say. Well, this is fitting, this portrait of failure, because Melville's entire life was defined by failure. And it's important to think about that to get into his novel Moby Dick. So Melville was born into an extremely wealthy, culturally affluent family. Both of his grandfathers were heroes in the Revolutionary War. They both had a lot of money, and that money came down to Melville's parents. Unfortunately, Melville's father turned out to be an inept businessman and squandered his fortune, and he got deeply into debt. And when he died of a fever that left him delirious for several days in front of his young boy Melville, when he died, the family was pretty much impoverished. So he went from opulence, having servants, huge houses in New York City, to basically having to quit posh private schools and go work as a clerk in a bank. And the family could no longer live in the expensive houses in New York City. Houses got smaller and smaller until eventually the family had to move up to Albany. So this is someone who was born with great expectations, and these expectations were undercut. Now, what happens? Eventually, Melville in 1839 decides that he wants to go to sea. So from 1839 to 1844, basically he travels the world in several different kinds of sea vessel. He starts out in a merchant vessel and just basically sails to England and back. Then he gets on a whaling ship and spends a long time on a whaling ship. Eventually, he jumps the whaling ship with a friend of his and spends some time in the Marquesas Islands. Then he finds another whaling ship and eventually ends up in Tahiti, where he participates in a mutiny and actually spends some time in jail. And then eventually he makes his way to Hawaii, and he has sailed in Navy ships. And when he comes home 5 years later, he has sailed in merchant ships, whaling ships, naval ships. He has mutinied. He has jumped ship. He worked as in a bowling pin, a bowling alley in Hawaii. He turned these years into the raw material that generated all of his major books. But it's important to note that he never was an officer. He was always of a very low rank. He made very little money. He's so far from Emerson, who went to Harvard and Harvard Divinity School. Melville probably would have, but he had basically to live as a very low class, impoverished, hard working man. Well, when he gets back to the United States, this is 1844, he starts telling his stories of his adventures to his friends, and they say, "Oh, this is fantastic. You should write these down." And he does. So in 1846, he publishes a novel, Typee, about his time in the Marquesas Island among the Typee tribe. And he follows this up with another novel called Umu, which is about his time in Tahiti and the mutiny. So he becomes a famous writer from the very beginning of his career, but not as a serious literary figure, kind of as a travel writer, we might say. But Melville wanted more. He was starting to read Shakespeare, he was starting to read Plato, he was reading Milton, and he thought, I don't want to be known as the man who lived among cannibals. I want to write serious literature. So he publishes this literary allegory called Marty, and it fails miserably. It's just fraught with ideas, it's brimming with ideas and overwrought prose. Fails miserably, critically and commercially. So he goes back to writing sort of sea adventure novels. Redburn, about being on the merchant ship going to Liverpool, and White Jacket, about his time on the naval ship. But all along, his mind is growing, and he's becoming increasingly ambitious, increasingly ambitious. So he starts this novel called Moby Dick. And it seems that at the beginning he wants it to be another kind of sea journey because he needs to make money for his growing family. But then he meets Hawthorne, the Hawthorne of the Scarlet Letter and of Twice Told Tales. And he suddenly realizes, whoa, this man is like a Shakespeare on the banks of America. And I want to write like Hawthorne writes. So what begins as a kind of rollicking adventure sea novel, Moby Dick, suddenly becomes this dark, brooding, highly experimental novel that became one of the great novels in American history. But of course, that book failed commercially and critically. And the book that Melville followed this with, called Pierre or the Ambiguities, his effort to try to write a Hamlet in America, it also fails. So Melville is a writer who defines himself by failure. But here's the turn. In a letter to Hawthorne, he says, I write those books that are said to fail, which of course means my books fail commercially and critically. But there's also a way in which failure is a virtue. If you're writing in a culture that is superficial, if you're writing in a culture that doesn't have literary taste, to fail can be a mark of distinction. Indeed, Melville wrote Moby Dick to be a failure if you measure it by the standards of a traditional novel, with plot and causality and consistency of voice and style. If you measure it against those standards, it fails miserably. But it fails because it's experimenting. It's a kind of anti-novel. It's a novel that doesn't have a clear plot. It's a novel that doesn't have a clear protagonist. It's a novel that has many different styles. It's a novel that is part not novel, that is part travel narrative, that is part cytology. So if failure made Melville miserable in his life, historical failure, aesthetic failure, let's call it, aesthetic failure gave him power as a writer. His experimentation, his undercutting of traditional novelistic expectations, traditional novelistic conventions, are precisely what gives Moby Dick its energy, its fecundity, and its wild experimentation.